Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to ancient Rome, a place of marble columns, sandal straps, and, apparently, a national obsession with hair color. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Let your thoughts slow down like a quiet evening in an old library. Because tonight, we're talking about something that sounds almost trivial, hair. But as always with the Romans, it turns out to be much stranger, a little sad, and occasionally, deeply ironic. Just a small, quiet thing. If you like drifting off to strange corners of history, you can leave a like or subscribe. Quietly, of course. It helps the channel, and it tells me you'd like more sleepy stories like this one. But for now, just relax. The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur and aqueducts and legions, had a surprisingly complicated relationship with beauty. And right near the top of that list was the question of hair color. Specifically, blonde hair. Now, if you picture ancient Romans, especially those stern-faced senators in marble, you probably imagine dark curls, olive skin, and that expression that says, "I have opinions about aqueduct funding." But in truth, Roman society spent centuries being weirdly fascinated by blondes. Not their own blondes, of course. Because, inconveniently, there weren't very many. Blonde hair in Rome didn't grow naturally very often. Italy, then as now, was a land of dark-haired people. Which meant that most blondes in ancient Rome were imports. Usually from somewhere cold, barbaric, and recently conquered. Let's drift to the 1st century BCE, when the Roman elite had begun importing slaves and concubines from Gaul, Germania, and beyond. These were regions full of tall, fair-haired people, which Romans simultaneously feared, mocked, and lusted after. And this contradiction became a cultural habit. Roman poets, ever the experts in double standards, wrote endlessly about their love for blonde women, and their disdain for the people who were actually blonde. To love the hair, but not the person it grew on, that was very Roman. We get one of our first hints from Ovid, who, between giving disastrous love advice and getting himself exiled, wrote that Roman women should absolutely dye their hair blonde to appear more alluring. He didn't mention that many of those golden wigs came from the scalps of captured Germanic women. That detail was less poetic. Yes, really, wealthy Roman women, even empresses, were known to wear wigs made from the hair of their conquered enemies. A trophy, turned into a fashion statement. If that sounds a little dark, that's because it was. Imagine sitting at a dinner party, complimenting someone's beautiful curls, only to realize they came from a battlefield north of the Rhine. Still, to the Roman mind, this was perfectly reasonable. Beauty, after all, was something to be taken, not born with. And so the blonde craze grew. By the time of Emperor Augustus, Rome's elite ladies were bleaching, dyeing, and wig shopping with dedication that would impress any modern influencer. They used concoctions of goat fat, ashes, and various minerals to lighten their hair, usually with results somewhere between sun-kissed and chemically startled. But they persisted. Because blonde hair wasn't just about beauty anymore. It had become a symbol of wealth, conquest, and a touch of exoticism, Roman women trying to embody the allure of the barbarian without the inconvenient barbarian origins. Naturally, Roman men had opinions. They always did. Some adored it. The poets waxed lyrical about golden-haired beauties like they were describing divine beings. Others sneered, calling dyed blondes frivolous and corrupt. The historian Tacitus, famously unimpressed by most things, mentioned the Germans' fair hair with a mix of envy and disdain. He admired their toughness but disapproved of their lack of civilization. Meanwhile, the Roman Senate probably had more pressing matters, like taxation or invasions, but still found time to police women's appearance. let's pause here. Because there's something both sad and fascinating about this. The blonde obsession wasn't really about hair, it was about power. Rome wanted to absorb the beauty of the conquered without admitting admiration for the conquered themselves. To wear their hair, but not their identity. It's the same impulse that drove Romans to fill their villas with Greek statues while calling the Greeks effeminate. To copy Egyptian fashion while mocking Egyptian religion. To romanticize Gauls while calling them savages. In other words, they wanted the aesthetics of everyone else, without the people. By the reign of Emperor Nero, things reached a kind of absurd climax. Because Nero, who was not known for moderation in anything, decided that blonde was the color of imperial glamour. His favorite mistress, Poppaea Sabina, was famously blonde, or at least she made sure to appear that way. She reportedly bathed in donkey milk, wore wigs of Germanic hair, and set trends for the entire empire. Soon, wealthy Roman women were rushing to emulate her look. There was an entire market for imported blonde wigs. Some even paid soldiers to bring back hair from the north. It's difficult to know whether the Germans appreciated this sudden demand. Probably not. Now, of course, not everyone was impressed. Stoic philosophers, Rome's resident killjoys, complained about the vanity of women who bleached their hair. Seneca, for instance, sighed that people were more concerned with the color of their locks than the state of their souls. Which is rich, considering he worked for Nero, a man who staged musicals about his own greatness. Still, Seneca wasn't entirely wrong. Roman society had started treating appearance as a battlefield, a place where morality, conquest, and class all tangled together. By the 2nd century CE, the blonde trend had become institutional. You could actually tell a woman's social rank by the complexity of her hairstyle, and often, by its color. Wealthy women favored elaborate braids and coils, frequently blonde. Meanwhile, lower-class women, who couldn't afford wigs or dyes, were mocked for their plain hair. And so, something that began as a fascination with northern captives turned into a marker of Roman aristocracy. There's a certain bleak poetry to that. The blonde hair of defeated enemies became a literal crown of Roman victory. But even Rome couldn't hold on to its trends forever. Eventually, fashions shifted, as they always do. By the late Empire, darker hair came back into style. Perhaps because wigs and dyes were expensive, or maybe because after centuries of decline, the empire was too tired to maintain vanity. Blonde hair became associated once more with foreignness, first Germanic, then Gothic, then barbarian. The empire fell, the marble crumbled, and blonde Roman wigs became just another curious artifact in museums. But the obsession didn't quite die. Europe would revisit it again and again, through the Renaissance, through Victorian England, and, unfortunately, through some much darker 20th century ideologies. The Romans had lit a small cultural spark, the idea that fair hair meant beauty, power, or purity. And history, being uncreative as usual, kept recycling it. Still, it's worth remembering that in ancient Rome, blonde hair meant something very specific. It meant control. It meant conquest disguised as glamour. And it's somehow fitting that Rome, the empire that stole the gods, languages, and architecture of others, also stole their hair. Because, of course it did. Let's drift a little further. Because this fascination with beauty didn't stop with hair. Oh no! The Romans had opinions about everything, from noses to ankles. And some of those opinions shaped the way the Western world still defines attractiveness today. So, as we fade gently into part 2, we'll explore how Roman ideals of beauty became strangely immortal, surviving long after the empire itself had turned to dust. Hey everyone! If you're still awake, well done. If you're drifting in and out, that's fine too. You're exactly where the Romans would have wanted you, relaxed, slightly decadent, and listening to someone talk about marble statues for far too long. So, let's drift back to Rome. Last time, we talked about their strange love affair with blonde hair. Tonight, we'll stay in the same candlelit villas and echoing bathhouses, but move a little deeper into the Roman idea of beauty itself. Because if there's one thing the Romans loved almost as much as conquering things, it was defining what was ideal. And then breaking their own rules, repeatedly. To the Roman mind, beauty wasn't just about attraction, it was a form of virtue. They believed that a perfect face reflected a perfect soul. Of course, that's a convenient belief when you're rich, well-fed, and have access to imported olive oil. Roman philosophers, particularly the moralists, insisted that physical beauty represented inner harmony. Balance of features, symmetry, proportion, all mirrored balance of mind. It sounded noble. But in practice, it meant that beauty was a kind of moral currency. And the ugly, the scarred, the poor, were quietly considered spiritually deficient. You can almost hear Seneca sighing into his wax tablet. Virtue and symmetry are one. A comforting thought for people who could afford mirrors. The ideal Roman man was, predictably, tall, broad-shouldered, and dignified. But not too muscular, that would make him look like a gladiator, and those were considered entertainment, not citizens. His hair was short and tidy, his face clean-shaven, though later emperors like Hadrian brought beards briefly back into fashion, pretending it was philosophical. In truth, it was probably just easier. He stood upright, calm, and ever so slightly bored, because boredom, in Rome, looked like confidence. Women had a harder time, of course. The Roman ideal for women was an exquisite contradiction. They were expected to be soft, pale, delicate, and utterly effortless, while secretly maintaining that look with a cosmetic arsenal that would make Cleopatra proud. Complexions were powdered with lead-based makeup. Lips tinted with crushed red ochre. Eyes darkened with soot and antimony, which sounds like a spell ingredient, but was just an early form of eyeliner. And because lead is toxic, Roman women often poisoned themselves slowly in the pursuit of appearing ethereal. The poet Juvenal, who never missed an opportunity to complain about women, once joked that a man could kiss his wife and taste the entire pharmacy of Rome. He meant it as an insult, but, to be fair, he wasn't wrong. Still, vanity was universal. Even men, despite all their speeches about Roman virtue, indulged in beauty treatments. They plucked, polished, and perfumed themselves, just discreetly. Nero, naturally, went overboard. He had slaves dedicated to his skincare routine and wore a hint of rouge during performances. Because of course he did. But even the more serious emperors weren't immune. Augustus, for instance, was famously self-conscious about his appearance. Suetonius tells us he had thinning hair, so he carefully combed it forward, centuries before the comb-over became a suburban art form. Now, the Romans didn't just create beauty standards, they also immortalized them. Literally. Walk into any Roman museum and you'll see those marble busts, all serene and perfectly balanced. But here's the secret, most of them are lies. Roman portraiture, especially for emperors and empresses, was essentially ancient Photoshop. Statues were sculpted to project divinity, health, and eternal youth. Wrinkles were softened, noses refined, and chins given heroic firmness. Sometimes the same ideal face was used for multiple people, artists just changed the hairstyle. Imagine the Empress Livia and an unknown priest sharing the same cheekbones. It's strangely democratic, in a creepy way. But not all Romans bought into the illusion. Some philosophers began to grumble that the obsession with appearance was corrupting society. Cicero, never short of an opinion, once said that a man's face should reflect his moral character. Which was bold, considering his own face looked perpetually anxious. Still, the tension between natural virtue and artificial beauty became a cultural undercurrent. Rome, like many empires, couldn't decide whether it admired simplicity or extravagance. So it did both. Loudly. By the imperial age, beauty had become a form of political propaganda. Emperors used their appearance to signal virtue or divinity. Augustus's statues always depicted him in the prime of life, even when he was old and frail. It sent a clear message: the emperor doesn't age like mortals. Meanwhile, empresses became trendsetters, their hairstyles copied across the empire. The Flavian coiffure, for example, those towering curls and intricate braids, wasn't just fashion. It was a statement of imperial prestige. Roman women would spend hours replicating the look, sometimes with help from enslaved hairdressers who specialized in constructing these sculptural masterpieces. And yes, wigs still made frequent appearances. Because even divine beauty needs scaffolding. If you were a woman in Rome, your appearance was your reputation. To be too plain was suspicious, perhaps you were lazy or ungrateful to the gods. To be too glamorous was also suspicious, perhaps you were immoral or scheming. In short, you couldn't win. And yet, they tried. They really did. Women mixed cosmetics with honey and vinegar, bathed in milk, exfoliated with crushed oyster shells, and wore small charms to protect against wrinkles. It's oddly touching how human that is. Across the centuries, people trying to look a little better, a little younger, a little more admired. Even if it meant scraping their faces with seashells. But of course, beauty never existed in isolation. It was always tangled up with power. A beautiful woman in Rome wasn't just admired, she was weaponized. Look at Cleopatra, for example. Though technically Egyptian, she became an enduring Roman obsession. Not because of her looks, necessarily. By Roman accounts, she wasn't conventionally beautiful, but because of her voice, her charisma, her ability to make powerful men lose their composure entirely. She became the archetype of dangerous beauty. The femme fatale who could undo empires with a glance. Roman writers loved to moralize about her. They painted her as both irresistible and corrupting, the embodiment of luxury itself. Of course, it wasn't really Cleopatra they were afraid of. It was what she represented, a woman with more influence than the Senate. Later, imperial women, Livia, Messalina, Agrippina, would inherit that uneasy duality. Each was judged not just by her deeds, but by how well she matched the Roman ideal. Livia, Augustus's wife, cultivated an image of serene virtue, modest dress, calm expression, golden hair arranged neatly. Behind that mask, she was one of the most politically powerful people in the empire. Messalina, on the other hand, was vilified for the same qualities: beauty, ambition, and independence, recast as vice. The message was clear: beauty was divine when controlled, dangerous when free. It's strange to think that an empire built on conquest and engineering was also, at its heart, fragile about appearances. But then again, maybe that's what made Rome so human. They built monuments to perfection, while privately terrified of decay. They worshipped beauty as a sign of order, even as their own society crumbled into chaos. In the end, Rome's obsession with the surface mirrored its politics, an endless performance of control, elegance, and dignity, while underneath, things were quietly falling apart. Let's take a slow breath here. The marble faces, the golden wigs, the powdered complexions, they've all turned to dust. But the ideas they left behind linger, faint as perfume on old parchment. We still talk about symmetry. We still idealize youth. We still equate beauty with worth. And though we've traded marble for filters, the impulse is the same. As we drift toward the next part, let's stay with this thought. Rome didn't just conquer the world, it conquered the mirror. And in part 3, we'll wander through another layer of Roman vanity, the strange, often comic rituals of personal hygiene and self-care that defined daily life. Because behind every statue-perfect face was someone anxiously scrubbing themselves in a public bathhouse. Hey everyone! If your eyes are starting to feel heavy, that's alright. This next part is slower, softer, and a little steamier, quite literally. Because tonight, we're wandering into the heart of Roman daily life, the public bathhouse. Now, if you picture ancient Rome at all, you might imagine the Colosseum or maybe the Senate House. But in truth, the real social center of the empire wasn't any of those. It was the Thermae, those vast, echoing temples of steam and gossip where Romans went to wash, chat, scheme, and occasionally, show off. It's funny to think about, really. An empire famous for conquest and law also spent half its days soaking in hot water. But then again, Romans were complicated like that. The first thing to understand about Roman bathing is that it wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about civilization. To be Roman meant to bathe. Frequently, extravagantly, and preferably in public. The baths were the empire's great equalizer. Rich and poor, soldier and senator, slave and freedman, they all came to the same steaming halls. Of course, the rich had fancier oils, and the poor had less space, but still, it was one of the few places in Rome where social hierarchy softened. For an hour or two, you could pretend everyone smelled equally of lavender oil and ambition. Let's step inside. The air is thick with steam, humming softly with conversation. The walls are tiled in marble, white, or maybe green-veined. Every surface glows faintly from the sunlight slipping through the high windows. You can hear the sound of dripping water, sandals slapping on stone, and someone loudly complaining about politics in the corner. Welcome to a Roman afternoon. Bathing was a ritual. Not a quick splash and go, but a carefully choreographed sequence. You'd start in the apoditorium, the changing room, where attendants guarded your clothes, sometimes honestly, sometimes not. The wealthy brought slaves to watch their belongings. Everyone else just hoped for the best. Then came the tepidarium, the warm room. Here, your body adjusted to the heat. People chatted, reclined, and admired each other's jewelry. Next was the caldarium, the hot room. Think of it as an ancient sauna, filled with thick steam rising from heated floors. The heat was intense enough to make you question your life choices. Romans believed sweating purified the body. Which, technically, it does, but mostly it made everyone smell faintly like baked olive oil. After that came the frigidarium, the cold plunge. A shock to the system, icy and invigorating. You'd gasp, maybe swear softly, and emerge feeling reborn, or at least, less faint. It was the Roman version of mindfulness, alternating between comfort and discomfort until you achieved something like serenity, or heat stroke. But the real entertainment wasn't the water. It was the people. Bathhouses were where Rome talked. Deals were made, alliances whispered, and scandals shared like communal bread. You could spot senators, philosophers, soldiers, poets, all wrapped in towels and trying to look philosophical while dripping. Even emperors occasionally joined in, though their visits were more like parades than relaxation. Emperor Caracalla, for instance, built one of the grandest bath complexes in history, a monument to excess, with towering vaults, gardens, libraries, and even gyms. It could host thousands at once. Because nothing says imperial might quite like a 30-acre steam room. The hygiene part came later. Roman cleanliness was creative. They didn't use soap the way we do. Instead, they coated their bodies with oil, olive oil, perfumed if they were lucky, and then scraped it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The process was oddly elegant. Oil, scrape, rinse. Repeat. It removed dirt, sweat, and skin cells, though not necessarily all the odors. Still, to the Roman mind, This was sophistication. The strigil wasn't just a tool, it was a status symbol. Some were made of bronze, others silver, engraved with delicate designs. A poor man's strigil might be plain iron. But the act was the same. Everyone, in the end, scraped themselves clean like olives being pressed. And then came the oiling. Roman men and women both loved their oils. They had entire boutiques devoted to scents: rose, myrrh, cinnamon, even saffron. To be unscented was considered rustic. To be too scented, however, was considered decadent. As usual, moderation was key. At least, in theory. In practice, wealthy Romans smelled like walking spice racks. Of course, no Roman custom was free from controversy. Moralists complained endlessly about the baths. Seneca called them dens of indulgence. Cato the Elder muttered that real men should bathe in cold water, quickly, and preferably in silence. He was not invited to many parties. Even Augustus, ever the moral reformer, worried that mixed bathing, men and women together, might lead to moral decay. Naturally, that only made it more popular. Still, the baths had a certain dignity. They were cleaner than most medieval towns would be 1,000 years later. They used hypocaust systems, underfloor heating fueled by furnaces, to warm the rooms. Slaves stoked the fires all day long, feeding the empire's obsession with comfort. For a civilization so fond of conquest, the Romans were remarkably devoted to lounging. And yet, not everyone was welcome. While technically public, many baths required small fees, and enslaved people could only enter at certain times. It was equality, with asterisks. Children played, philosophers debated, and somewhere in the corner, a poet composed verses about steam. Because of course they did. The baths became a mirror of Roman society, glorious on the surface, complicated beneath it. And perhaps the most poetic detail of all: the same water that cleansed emperors also washed away the dust of laborers. In the end, everyone floated together in the same warm pools. It's almost touching, if you ignore the hygiene implications. By the late Empire, bathhouses had reached their peak. Even small towns had them. They became so integral to daily life that emperors built baths just to gain public favor. But as the centuries passed, the system began to crumble, literally. Without stable income and slave labor, maintaining the hypocausts became too expensive. Fires went out, pipes rusted, and marble halls fell silent. When the Western Empire finally collapsed, the baths cooled too. And Europe, for a long, dark stretch, decided that bathing was suspiciously Roman. Medieval monks later argued that cleanliness distracted from piety. And so, the continent quietly returned to dirt. It would be 1,000 years before people bathed regularly again. So maybe, in their own steamy way, the Romans were ahead of their time. They didn't just build baths, they built a culture of comfort. They understood something simple, something timeless. That shared spaces, warm water, and idle conversation could hold a society together. Even if it smelled faintly of olive oil and ambition. Let's linger on that image for a moment. Marble walls. Soft steam. Laughter echoing down the corridors. 1,000 voices, all different, yet part of the same empire, just trying to feel clean, human, and alive. That's Rome, in the end. Grand, ridiculous, and deeply human. In the next part, we'll drift away from the steam and into something chillier, Roman medicine. Because if you've ever wondered how an empire so obsessed with bathing also believed that sneezing could be caused by evil spirits, you're in for a gently absurd treat. Let's drift a little further into this golden haze, where blonde hair wasn't just a style choice, it was a full-time occupation. And like many full-time occupations in ancient Rome, it was miserable, time-consuming, and probably smelled faintly of goat fat. Because the truth is, the ancient Romans didn't just like blonde hair. They became a little unhinged about it. Once blonde was established as a social ideal, every woman who couldn't naturally achieve it, so almost everyone in Italy, began to chase it with all the quiet desperation of someone trying to join an exclusive club that doesn't actually want them there. And they did it the Roman way, by inventing wildly impractical and often dangerous beauty rituals. One of the most common methods was to use bleach. Not the tidy kind we think of, no, the Romans made theirs from a potent mix of ashes, vinegar, and goat fat. They'd smear it over their dark hair and sit in the sun for hours, hoping for a divine transformation. What they got was usually dry, brittle, vaguely orange hair, and a scalp that hated them forever. Still, if you walked through the streets of Rome in, say, the 1st century CE, you might notice the strange scent of these hair concoctions wafting through upper-class neighborhoods. It was the smell of fashion and mild chemical burns. Of course, not everyone relied on homegrown chemistry. Some Romans preferred wigs. Imported ones. The most expensive came from Germany and Gaul, where, conveniently, the people were naturally fair-haired, and also, unfortunately for them, frequently conquered by Rome. So, while Roman generals celebrated their victories, back in the capital, their wives were purchasing trophies of those same campaigns, blonde wigs made from the hair of enslaved women. It's one of those Roman contradictions. They admired barbarian beauty, but only when it was detachable and available at market price. A wealthy Roman woman might have owned several wigs, some blonde, some auburn, maybe one in black for mourning days. They'd be arranged on little stands in the dressing room, carefully oiled and perfumed. It was like having a shelf of social status you could wear. And yes, men noticed. Poets like Ovid wrote entire sections on women's hair, because of course he did. In his Ars Amatoria, he offers advice that's less romantic and more like a beauty blog gone slightly wrong. He tells women that wigs are fine, as long as they're flattering, and preferably not too obviously foreign, advice that probably went unheeded by everyone. He also makes it clear that a woman's hair color could send signals. Blonde? Youthful and alluring. Black? Serious and respectable. Red? Mischievous, maybe too much so. Essentially, Roman women's hair functioned like an ancient social media bio, a quick, misleading snapshot of identity. And while we're talking about misleading, let's pause on one particularly strange Roman fear: baldness. The men were terrified of it. And who could blame them? Julius Caesar, brilliant, ambitious, conqueror of Gaul, spent much of his life trying to hide his receding hairline. He arranged his hair forward over his forehead, comb-over style, and wore laurel wreaths whenever possible, as if the general public couldn't tell the difference between imperial fashion and strategic coverage. When the Senate granted him permission to wear the laurel crown permanently, he must have breathed the deepest sigh of relief in Roman history. But Caesar wasn't alone. Emperor Otho, Nero's short-lived successor, was so ashamed of his thinning hair that he wore a wig everywhere, even to bed, which must have been awkward for everyone involved. Suetonius tells us he'd even adjust it constantly in public, terrified someone might notice the seam. The anxiety was real. In a society obsessed with youth, beauty, and vitality, baldness was a public tragedy. Ironically, many Romans blamed hair dye for causing it. So the same potions that made women's hair blonde might have been responsible for making men bald. A small price to pay, apparently, for keeping up appearances. Let's drift for a moment into one of those little Roman beauty salons, or what passed for them. A wealthy matron sits in her atrium, surrounded by slaves. One is heating a concoction over a small charcoal brazier, another is gently combing out a wig made of imported German hair. The air smells of vinegar, burnt oil, and rosewater. The woman sighs, complaining that her blonde shade looks too provincial. Her husband walks by, pretending not to notice that the hair color of the day seems suspiciously familiar to the one on the head of his new favorite dancer at the theater. Everyone smiles, politely pretending not to see the hypocrisy. Because that's what the blonde ideal became, a mix of desire, imitation, and denial. Rome was fascinated by northern beauty, but never wanted to admit it. They could adore fair hair in private poems, but in public, they reminded everyone that true Roman virtue had nothing to do with appearances. It was a dance between admiration and superiority, one that would last centuries. By the time of the later empire, blonde hair had become not just fashionable, but imperial. Empresses like Poppaea Sabina, Nero's famously vain wife, were said to wash their hair in donkey's milk to keep it soft and golden. And yes, there's some evidence that wealthy women actually kept entire herds of donkeys for this purpose. Imagine explaining that on your estate ledger: expenses, 40 donkeys, for bathing. It's both absurd and perfectly Roman. Let's drift one last time, through the fading glow of the empire. The blonde ideal, once imported, had become Roman property, and with that, it began to fade. As invasions grew and provinces slipped away, the blonde-haired barbarians who had once inspired envy were now conquering the empire itself. By the 5th century, the streets of Rome were filled with fair-haired soldiers, not as fashion icons, but as victors. And perhaps, somewhere in the confusion, an aging Roman aristocrat might have glanced at them and thought, well, at least the hair looks nice. Softly now, let's drift away from the marble baths and gold-tinted curls of ancient Rome. The night grows quieter, and the candles burn low. In our next part, we'll wander forward in time, to the Middle Ages, where blonde hair took on new meanings entirely: purity, holiness, and divine light, though the same chaos of human vanity remained beneath the surface. Hey everyone, still awake? That's okay if you're not. Tonight, we're gliding quietly out of ancient marble courtyards and into the hushed, candlelit cathedrals of the Middle Ages, where blonde hair stopped being about seduction and started being about salvation. At least, that's what people like to pretend. You see, the medieval mind loved symbols. Every color, every gesture, every tiny detail in art or poetry carried a layer of meaning. And in this age of saints and sinners, blonde hair became one of the holiest symbols of all. In paintings, angels always had golden hair, light cascading like sunbeams, shining against blue robes and halos. The Virgin Mary, though rarely described that way in scripture, was often painted as softly blonde too, not because of history, but because European artists thought light hair reflected divine purity. The logic was curious. Apparently, the closer your hair resembled sunlight, the closer your soul must be to heaven. It's a very medieval way of thinking, beautifully symbolic, but conveniently flattering to pale Europeans who just so happened to fit the divine aesthetic. And yet, there was irony in this, too. Because in everyday life, the same golden hair that symbolized holiness in art could also mean vanity, temptation, or even sin. Take medieval poetry, for example. The troubadours of southern France adored describing their idealized lovers, golden-haired maidens with skin like lilies and snow. But in the same breath, preachers were warning women not to dye their hair, lest they invite the devil's attention. Apparently, hell had a strict dress code, and freshly bleached hair was part of it. So once again, we find that familiar tension: desire on one side, morality on the other. And standing awkwardly in between, the women themselves, who were just trying to survive both. Let's drift for a moment into a medieval lady's chamber. The room smells of lavender, beeswax, and something vaguely herbal. The mirror on the wall is polished metal, just enough to catch the reflection of pale skin and faint candlelight. She's preparing for a feast. On the table beside her sits a small bowl filled with an alarming mixture of saffron, lye, and pigeon droppings, a natural hair lightener. Because yes, even in the age of knights and saints, people were still smearing questionable substances on their heads for beauty. Some things never change. She's been told that golden hair makes her look angelic, more marriageable, more divine. She's also been told that it's a sin to alter God's creation. She decides to risk the sin. Because being plain, in a world obsessed with appearances, is its own kind of punishment. Outside her window, church bells toll. Inside, she waits for the potion to set. Somewhere, an artist is painting another haloed saint with sunlight-colored curls. And history quietly hums along, perfectly inconsistent. It's worth noting that not all medieval blondes were admired. Writers often contrasted good blondes, pure, ethereal, untouched, with bad blondes, seductive, deceptive, and morally dangerous. It's the same double standard that would echo for centuries. Women were either angels or temptresses, never simply human. Even the great poets played along. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, describes Beatrice as radiant, glowing, her hair shimmering like gold in heaven's light. But in other medieval tales, the golden-haired woman is often the downfall of kings, a shimmering symbol of lust and ruin. The color gold, after all, wasn't just sacred. It was also greedy. And in that contradiction, the Middle Ages found endless material. Let's drift a little deeper, into the monasteries, where monks wrote long treatises about sin, temptation, and the dangers of feminine beauty. One particularly anxious friar warned that women who dyed their hair were painting lies upon the head, and that the devil rejoiced at each rinse. One wonders what he might have thought of the Virgin Mary's flaxen curls in the stained glass window above his altar. Still, hair was power. And even the pious understood that. Queens and noble women guarded their hair like treasure. During coronations, some let it flow freely as a symbol of virtue and vitality, others kept it veiled, signaling chastity and restraint. Hair wasn't just decoration. It was identity, reputation, morality, and sometimes, strategy. Consider Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her age. Chroniclers often remarked on her beauty, especially her golden hair, which became a kind of political weapon. Eleanor used her image to command loyalty and attention, something rare for a medieval woman. Her blonde tresses appeared in troubadour songs and courtly romances, always glowing, always unattainable. It wasn't just hair anymore, it was propaganda. And yet, even the queens couldn't escape the gossip. For every poem praising a noblewoman's locks of spun gold, there was a sermon warning that too much attention to one's hair meant pride, the deadliest sin of all. To look beautiful was to risk damnation. To look plain was to risk being forgotten. You could never win. Somewhere in the 13th century, a curious compromise appeared: veils and wimples. Women began covering their hair almost entirely, in church, at court, even in portraits. It was modest, yes, but also elegant. You could still hint at the color beneath, and artists would oblige by painting a few golden strands peeking from under white linen. It was as if medieval women had collectively said, "Fine, we'll be holy, but fashionably." And of course, the artists leaned into it. In paintings, saints' hair gleamed like candlelight. Christ himself was often depicted with softly curling, reddish gold hair, an image far removed from his likely Middle Eastern appearance. Europe had sanctified its own reflection, turning the divine into a familiar mirror. Let's pause here, for a moment of quiet irony. The same culture that told women not to obsess over beauty was commissioning thousands of works of art where holiness looked suspiciously like idealized European youth. It's almost funny, in that tired medieval way. But as the centuries drifted on, something began to shift again. By the late Middle Ages, blonde hair, once sacred, began to take on a more dangerous tone. The Renaissance was dawning, and with it came a rediscovery of the ancient world, of Venus, Aphrodite, and every golden-haired goddess who had ever caused trouble for mortals. Once again, light hair was back in fashion, and this time, it wasn't about holiness. It was about allure. Let's drift gently toward that transformation, from saintly halos to sensual portraits. From divine light to earthly desire. The blonde, it seemed, could never stay in one box for long. Hey everyone, let's keep drifting. The candles of the Middle Ages are burning low now, and somewhere, a painter is grinding gold pigment into oil. The world is waking up from its long medieval sleep, and everything suddenly feels a little more human again. Welcome to the Renaissance, an age of rediscovery, marble statues, and, naturally, blondes. Because of course, when Europe decided to reinvent itself, it went straight back to ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration. The artists copied their forms, the scholars copied their ideas, and the ladies, well, they copied their hair color. If the Middle Ages had made blonde hair holy, the Renaissance made it desirable again. Sacred light turned back into sunlight, and every painter in Florence seemed to fall in love with the same golden-haired woman. Let's start with Botticelli, because where else could we? His Birth of Venus has become one of the most recognizable paintings in the world, a woman with impossibly long, pale hair standing on a seashell, the wind teasing her curls. It's delicate, serene, strangely unreal, and yet, it sparked a real cultural obsession. That hair, not quite yellow, not quite gold, was called biondo veneziano, or Venetian blonde. And in the 15th century, it was the look to have. Women in Venice would spend hours perfecting it. They climbed onto their rooftops, spread their hair over wide-brimmed hats with the crowns cut out, and sat for hours under the sun. They coated their hair with mixtures of lye, sulfur, and lemon juice, because apparently, scalp health was a distant second to social status. The result was a shimmering, pale gold that glowed in candlelight, and probably smelled faintly of citrus and regret. Venice, of course, was perfect for this kind of vanity. The city lived for display, glittering canals, elaborate masks, silk gowns that shimmered like water. A city that thrived on beauty was bound to turn hair color into an art form. And like all art forms, it came with rules. The ideal Venetian blonde wasn't brassy or yellow, it was soft, like flax or honey. Too light, and it looked ghostly. Too dark, and it was common. Some beauty manuals even gave recipes for the perfect shade. They involved saffron, alum, and pigeon droppings. Again, the pigeons, apparently, never got a break in this story. Let's pause on the irony. The Renaissance claimed to celebrate natural beauty. And yet, people were literally bleaching themselves for hours in the sun to look more natural. But the Renaissance blonde wasn't just about vanity. She was also a symbol, an ideal. Painters used blonde hair to capture purity, grace, and sensuality all at once. It was the color of divine women, goddesses, saints, and courtesans alike. That last one might sound surprising, but Renaissance Venice was full of courtesans, highly educated women who moved in elite circles, quoted Latin poetry, and charged handsomely for their company. Many of them were famous for their golden hair, which they flaunted in portraits with the same serene confidence as Botticelli's Venus. Blonde became shorthand for both virtue and vice, depending entirely on who was looking. One of the most famous of these women was Veronica Franco, a Venetian poet and courtesan in the 16th century. She wrote verses defending women's intelligence and dignity, while also posing for portraits that emphasized her fair curls and calm, knowing eyes. Her beauty made her desirable, her mind made her dangerous. And the blonde hair, soft, shining, perfectly Renaissance, tied it all together. Of course, the men were just as fixated. Poets like Petrarch and Ariosto filled their sonnets with golden-haired muses, their verses shimmering with admiration and longing. You could say the Renaissance blonde became the ultimate muse, a dream made of light and paint and poetry. But not everyone looked like Botticelli's Venus. In fact, most people didn't. Southern Europe, with its naturally darker hair, wasn't exactly overflowing with natural blondes. Which meant, once again, everyone started faking it. Hairdressers mixed dangerous bleaches, barbers sold tonics, and apothecaries hawked miraculous hair waters made with quicklime. For the wealthy, wigs became an easier solution. The blonde wig trade boomed, just as it had in ancient Rome. It was, in a sense, history repeating itself, but now with better paintings. And those paintings told their own quiet stories. If you look closely at portraits of Renaissance women, you'll see how hair became a kind of status language. Loose blonde hair often meant sensuality or virginity, depending on context. Braided or pinned hair signaled respectability. Covered hair meant modesty, though artists still let a few golden strands slip through, because, well, aesthetics. And when painters like Leonardo da Vinci turned their attention to women, think of La Belle Fernière or Ginevra de Benci, their soft, blonde hair almost seems to glow from within. It's not just pigment, it's atmosphere. Leonardo famously studied how light bounced through fine strands, making them look like gold spun from air. It was science, beauty, and mysticism all at once. Of course, the obsession had its critics. Some churchmen worried that all this attention to hair, and to women, might distract from spiritual matters. They were right, but no one was listening. The Renaissance wasn't about restraint. It was about seeing and wanting. And blonde hair became a visual shorthand for that desire. Let's drift for a moment, back to Botticelli's studio in Florence. The air smells of linseed oil and marble dust. Light filters through high windows, landing on the half-finished form of Venus. Botticelli's brush moves slowly, tracing another curl of gold against the pale blue of the sea. Outside, the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore toll. Inside, time stands still. In that gentle silence, you can almost feel what the Renaissance felt, that beauty was a kind of salvation. That art could make the fleeting eternal. And that somewhere between heaven and humanity, there was a woman with hair like sunlight, forever turning her gaze toward us. But the Renaissance, like all golden ages, couldn't last forever. As Europe moved into the Baroque era, beauty became heavier, richer, more artificial. Wigs grew taller. Curls became sculpted. Hair color became less a matter of natural beauty and more a declaration of power. The soft glow of Botticelli's Venus would give way to the powdered splendor of Versailles. So let's drift again, from the sunlit rooftops of Venice to the gilded halls of Louis XIV's France, where blonde hair was no longer divine or sensual, just fashionable. Hey everyone, let's drift a little further into the glow. The Renaissance sunlight is fading now, and in its place rises a new kind of brightness, candlelight glittering off mirrors, chandeliers, and gold leaf. We're gliding into Versailles. A palace so magnificent that even the air seems rehearsed. If blonde hair in ancient Rome was about desire, and in the Renaissance about ideal beauty, then at Versailles, it became theater. Because in the 17th and 18th centuries, everything was theater. The clothes, the etiquette, the emotions, even the hair. The French court was obsessed with display, with looking effortless while secretly spending hours achieving it. And naturally, hair became one of the most elaborate props in that performance. Let's start with Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. He didn't have blonde hair, but he made sure everyone around him glowed like the sun anyway. Louis's court revolved around him, literally, and appearance was a kind of currency. The closer you were to his light, the higher your status shone. The king himself favored long, flowing wigs, dark and regal. But soon, everyone began wearing wigs of their own, each taller and more ornate than the last. By the time of Louis XV and Louis XVI, these wigs had evolved into architectural feats, powdered, perfumed, and occasionally decorated with miniature ships or fruit baskets. And many of them, naturally, were blonde. that wasn't by accident. Blonde hair had drifted, once again, into fashion, this time as a symbol of youth, charm, and aristocratic delicacy. Powdering a wig white or pale gold made you look refined, untouched by the sun or manual labor. The paler the powder, the purer the person. So yes, what had once been natural became artificial again, in the most extravagant way possible. Let's drift into a dressing room at Versailles around 1770. A lady's maid stands on a stool, gently dusting her mistress's towering coiffure with pale powder. The air fills with a soft cloud of starch and perfume. The scent is faintly floral, rosewater and violet, but underneath, there's a note of musty fabric, of hours-old candle smoke. The mistress sits perfectly still. Her neck aches slightly from the weight of her hair. She smiles anyway. She's expected to. The blonde powder, made from ground rice, starch, or even bone, catches the light, giving her hair a ghostly, shimmering quality. She looks ethereal, otherworldly. Like a statue brought to life. That's exactly the point. It was a kind of human illusion, to look timeless, untouchable, suspended somewhere between life and portraiture. And nowhere was this illusion perfected more completely than by Marie Antoinette. The Austrian-born Queen of France, young, beautiful, famously blonde, became the ultimate trendsetter of her time. Her hairdresser, Leonard Audie, was practically a celebrity. His creations could rise over 3 feet tall, supported by wire frames and stuffed with cushions, feathers, and flowers. Sometimes they even told stories. One week, she might wear a pouf à la belle poule, a sculpted hairstyle featuring a miniature ship, celebrating a French naval victory. Another week, perhaps a pastoral theme, silk ribbons, fake wheat stalks, and butterflies perched among the curls. It was artistry, absurdity, and power all wound together in powdered silk and hairpins. Marie Antoinette's natural hair was a soft blonde, something she accentuated with pale powder and light wigs. Portraits by Elizabeth Vigée Lebrun show her glowing under gentle light, her hair almost blending with the lace of her gowns. The effect is mesmerizing. She looks untouchable, serene, and somehow, unreal. That was the goal. Because in a world where politics and gossip were indistinguishable, the Queen's image mattered more than her voice. Her hair spoke for her, about taste, elegance, and status, even as it became the subject of endless mockery. Pamphlets accused her of vanity, extravagance, and worse. Each poof, each feather, each pale curl became another symbol of the excess that separated Versailles from the rest of France. While the poor starved, the courtiers powdered their wigs. While bread disappeared from the markets, the Queen's hair grew taller by the week. And eventually, that illusion collapsed. When the French Revolution came, powder became dangerous. Literally. It was taxed heavily, seen as a symbol of aristocratic waste. Wigs were confiscated. Powdered hair became unfashionable overnight. In its place, people embraced simplicity, short, natural styles inspired by the ancient Romans and Greeks. The pendulum had swung again. In the candlelit ruins of Versailles, the powdered blondes faded like ghosts. The Queen herself, the most famous of them all, went to her fate in 1793, her golden hair cut short, her crown replaced by the plain bonnet of a prisoner. Even her execution was stripped of spectacle. It was a quiet end to a century that had lived for appearances. Let's pause here for a moment. There's something haunting in how hair, so delicate, so transient, became a symbol of power, beauty, and downfall. Blonde hair had drifted through centuries, changing shape with every era, divine in one age, seductive in another, and deadly in the next. And yet, even after the fall of Versailles, the fascination never truly died. The 19th century would bring new blondes, literary ones this time. Victorian poets and painters would resurrect the image of the golden-haired angel, soft, pale, and doomed. The Romantic movement would give us the blonde ideal all over again, this time draped in melancholy instead of lace. So let's drift one more time, from the powdered air of Versailles into the fog-damped streets of Victorian London, where golden hair shimmered again, but now under gaslight. The air is different now. Gone is the powdered perfume of Versailles. We've stepped into London, grey, gaslit, and shrouded in coal smoke. The streets smell of wet cobblestone, horse sweat, and ink. And somewhere above the fog, in a painter's studio lit by oil lamps, the image of the blonde woman is being reborn. But this time, she isn't a queen. She's a muse. A ghost. A symbol of purity, or temptation, depending on who's holding the brush. The Victorians had a complicated relationship with beauty. They worshipped it, feared it, moralized it, and secretly indulged in it. And blonde hair, once the crown of Venus and the vanity of Versailles, became something subtler, stranger, and darker. Let's start with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that group of romantic, half-mad artists who decided the world had become too industrial, too ugly, too mechanical. They wanted to bring back beauty, but not the powdered, perfect kind. They painted women with long, unbound hair that looked alive, like it could breathe, or whisper. And more often than not, it was blonde. But not golden, sunlit blonde. It was pale, melancholy blonde, hair that glowed against shadow. Think of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Beata Beatrix, or John Everett Millais Ophelia floating lifeless in her river of flowers. Their blondes weren't queens, they were saints, sinners, and dreamers all at once. Victorian writers followed suit. Poets and novelists filled their pages with delicate, fair-haired heroines, fragile, angelic, and inevitably doomed. They called them the angel in the house. Soft-spoken. Devoted. Gentle. A woman to be admired, and controlled. But here's the twist, the Victorians were also obsessed with the other blonde, the fallen one. The courtesan. The seductress. The woman who looked like an angel but behaved like a demon. You can see her in the pages of Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, in the shadows of London's music halls, or in the eyes of Rossetti's mistresses. Golden-haired, tragic, dangerous. Blonde hair became a kind of moral warning, in a moral fantasy. The innocent girl and the ruined woman looked almost the same. It was the gaze of the viewer, male, moralizing, that decided which was which. And in this world of contradictions, some women decided to use the myth to their advantage. They dyed their hair with peroxide, wore pale wigs, or used powders made of lemon juice and sunlight to achieve that coveted color. Because by now, blonde wasn't just a hair color. It was an identity. A kind of currency. Actresses and courtesans, like the famous blonde Venus of the 1890s, used their golden hair to climb the ladder of fame. Men projected purity onto them, others projected sin. Either way, they got attention. And attention was power. Even science joined the obsession. Victorian anthropologists and phrenologists, those men who thought skull shapes could explain personality, began to classify human traits by hair color. To them, blondes were gentle, emotional, and artistic, brunettes were rational, mysterious, or dangerous. It was nonsense, of course, pseudoscience wrapped in prejudice, but it reflected how deeply the idea of the blonde had sunk into the cultural imagination. And then, in the literary twilight of the 19th century, something shifted again. Writers like Oscar Wilde and Thomas Hardy began to question these ideals. In Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, beauty becomes a mask for rot, eternal youth covering moral decay. In Hardy's Tess of the D'Urberville, Tess, described with dark hair, notably not blonde, becomes a victim of a world that worships purity while destroying it. It was as if the Victorians finally realized what they'd been doing all along. Turning women, especially beautiful ones, into symbols instead of people. Still, the image persisted. Even as the century closed, and the 20th century's electricity began to hum in the distance, the blonde woman, fragile, pure, doomed, remained fixed in the cultural imagination like a haloed ghost. Let's slow the moment here. You can almost see her, sitting by a window, pale light pooling around her shoulders, hair like spun silk reflecting the gray dawn. A figure out of time. Too perfect to exist, and yet, we keep resurrecting her. Because the Victorians didn't just give us railways and telegrams, they gave us aesthetic addiction. They taught the modern world how to look at beauty, and how to suffer for it. And as the gaslights dimmed and cinema flickered to life, the blonde myth simply adapted again, this time for the screen. It wouldn't be long before another age crowned its own golden idols: Jean Harlow, Marilyn Monroe, Grace Kelly. But before we drift into that neon-lit dream, let's make one last stop, in the early 20th century. A new world of war, cinema, and reinvention. The stage was set for the modern blonde, both goddess and ghost, reborn under studio lights. So, here we are. The gas lamps have gone out. The cameras have switched on. And the blonde, once a Roman fantasy, a Renaissance muse, a powdered duchess, and a Victorian ghost, now has her face projected 30 feet tall onto a cinema screen. The early 20th century was an era of reinvention, and no one embraced that more than Hollywood. People weren't just watching movies, they were watching dreams. And in those dreams, the blonde became something new. She became cinematic. It started with the silent films. Those flickering, grainy worlds where everything depended on faces, on light, shadow, and expression. And light, as it turns out, adored blonde hair. Under the harsh glare of early studio lamps, golden hair didn't just shine, it glowed. Dark hair vanished into shadow, blonde hair shimmered. Cameras fell in love, and audiences followed. By the 1920s, Hollywood had found its first golden goddess, Jean Harlow. She wasn't a delicate duchess or a timid muse, she was bold, funny, unapologetically sensual. They called her the blonde bombshell, which sounds like a marketing slogan, because it was. Harlow's studio, MGM, reportedly bleached her hair so aggressively it nearly dissolved. But it worked. She gleamed like moonlight, otherworldly, untouchable. And the world couldn't look away. Hollywood didn't invent the blonde ideal, but it industrialized it. It packaged beauty, sold it by the reel, and exported it to the entire planet. The camera loved blondes, and soon, the audience believed they should, too. But something deeper was happening, too. The cinematic blonde split into archetypes, two of them, mostly. The innocent blonde, and the dangerous blonde. You can still see them today. The innocent blonde, wide-eyed, gentle, graceful, was everything America wanted to believe it was after the war. She smiled sweetly. She didn't threaten anyone. Think of Grace Kelly, that cool, immaculate serenity. Or Doris Day, the wholesome girl next door who somehow made domesticity look glamorous. Then there was the other blonde. The one who knew what she was doing. The one who made men nervous. That was your Marlene Dietrich, your Veronica Lake, your Lana Turner, women who could ruin reputations with a raised eyebrow. But no one captured that contradiction quite like Marilyn Monroe. She wasn't born blonde, of course, she was born Norma Jean Mortensen, with brown hair and a difficult life. But when she stepped into the Hollywood machine, it bleached her into something else, into an icon. Her hair became her identity, her power, her curse. She was radiant and fragile at the same time, the perfect embodiment of America's paradoxical desires. Purity and lust, innocence and corruption, all wrapped in peroxide and diamonds. And if you listen closely, you can hear the echoes of every age before her. The Romans chasing fair-haired slaves. The medieval maidens washed in sunlight. The powdered courtiers of Versailles. the Victorians whispering about angels and sin. It's all there, woven into one soft, tragic smile. Because Marilyn wasn't just playing a role, she was repeating a pattern. The blonde is ideal. The blonde is fantasy. The blonde is sacrifice. By the 1950s, every woman who wanted to make it in Hollywood, or even just to be noticed, understood the message. If you want to be seen, you have to shine. And nothing shines like gold. The peroxide boom began. Salons filled with women clutching magazine cutouts of Monroe and Jane Mansfield. They wanted that same glow, that same illusion. But what they often got was burnt scalps and broken ends. Because, of course, beauty always came at a cost. Film theorists in later decades would call it the male gaze. But in simpler terms, the blonde was no longer a person, she was a lens. A mirror reflecting desire, perfection, and emptiness. She didn't age, she didn't eat, she didn't exist outside the frame. She was light, carefully arranged, softly tragic light. Marilyn's death in 1962 marked more than the loss of a movie star. It was the end of an era, the ultimate proof that the myth had consumed the woman. After that, Hollywood's blondes changed again. They became sharper, colder, self-aware. Grace Kelly left film to become an actual princess, which, given history, feels almost inevitable. Brigitte Bardot brought the blonde into the age of rebellion, tousled, untamed, and defiantly modern. Then came the 1970s and 80s, when blondes weren't angels anymore, they were thrillers, detectives, CEOs, femme fatale with briefcases and broken morals. And yet, even now, the myth hasn't died. It just keeps shedding its skin. Think of every era's it girl, Madonna in the 80s. Gwyneth in the 90s. Margot Robbie today. The hair changes slightly. The lighting improves. The narrative pretends it's new. But deep down, it's the same ancient story, about purity, power, and perception. You could say the world never stopped worshipping Venus. We just swapped marble for pixels. And so, from Roman altars to Hollywood soundstages, the golden hair has glowed, shifting meaning with every century but never losing its pull. Because it's never just been about beauty. It's about projection. We see what we want to see, and what we want, apparently, hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. Let's drift now, softly, toward the final thoughts, toward what the blonde really means when the lights go out, and the reels stop spinning. So here we are, at the end of a very long strand of hair. From Roman villas to Hollywood studios, from marble goddesses to movie stars, the blonde has shimmered through every age, a quiet constant in humanity's strange little obsession with beauty. And now, in the quiet of this moment, let's drift backward for a second, not to the past, but to the mirror. Because the story of the blonde isn't really about hair. It's about reflection. It's about what every era wanted to see staring back at it. For the Romans, blonde hair meant conquest. It was a trophy, plundered from the north, woven into their wigs as proof that the empire stretched far and wide. For the Renaissance, it meant holiness and sensuality all at once, angels and courtesans painted in the same golden light. For the Victorians, it meant innocence, the angel of the hearth, radiant and obedient. And for Hollywood, it meant fantasy itself, a glow that could be captured, marketed, and sold by the frame. Every age reshaped the myth to suit its own needs. And in doing so, they all forgot something rather simple, that real hair, real people, and real beauty are far messier than the myths we create. The blonde became less of a person and more of a symbol. A blank canvas, ready for projection. Men wrote poetry about her. Women were told to become her. But she never really existed, at least, not as the world imagined. Even the ancient languages reflected that fluidity. In Latin, flavus could mean blonde, golden, or just bright. In Old English, fair meant beautiful, not necessarily light-haired. The categories were always soft-edged, interchangeable, invented. And yet, across millennia, we kept trying to define, control, and idealize this one shimmering trait, as if it could explain something profound about human worth. There's a sort of irony in that. Because, at its heart, the blonde myth is about longing. It's about the unreachable, the light you can never quite touch. That's why painters chased it, poets praised it, and filmmakers lit it just so. It wasn't about hair. It was about glow. A glow that could represent purity, temptation, or power, depending on the century, or the gaze. But always a glow that seemed to exist somewhere just beyond the real. You might notice, too, how the blonde myth has always been tied to control. In every era, those in power decided what blonde meant, who could embody it, who should aspire to it. In Rome, it marked conquered beauty. In the Middle Ages, sanctified beauty. In Versailles, political beauty. And in Hollywood, commercial beauty. Each time, the same soft hair, but an entirely different chain of ownership. And yet, even knowing all that, we still find ourselves drawn to it. Not out of ignorance, but maybe out of instinct. Because golden light does something to us, biologically, emotionally, almost primally. It reminds us of warmth, safety, dawn. It whispers of things that fade, and we love things that fade. Maybe that's why every culture keeps resurrecting its own version of the blonde, even those where naturally blonde hair barely exists. Japan has anime heroines with gold hair. India's film stars sometimes bleach theirs for a role. Pop culture has made it global, this faint, glowing ghost of an ideal. A soft symbol that still hovers in every beauty ad, every screen, every scroll. But like all myths, it's starting to fracture. The world is a little wiser now, and more diverse, more self-aware. We see how narrow ideals once trapped whole generations of people in mirrors they didn't choose. And maybe, just maybe, we're ready to let go of the idea that light equals perfection. Still, myths die slowly. Especially the gentle ones. The ones that shimmer rather than scream. Even now, the blonde still wanders through our collective imagination, from Botticelli's seashell to Barbie's convertible, from Norse sagas to streaming shows. Her image keeps adapting, quietly surviving, like a soft echo of everything humanity has ever wanted to believe about beauty, and power, and light. And perhaps that's the real reason she endures. Because she isn't real, and that makes her eternal. Every civilization dreams of something golden. A sun, a crown, a god, a woman. We keep chasing that same radiance, century after century, as if it might finally tell us something true about ourselves. But all it tells us, really, is this. Humans are storytellers. We build myths from pigments and peroxide, from poetry and projection. And we call it beauty. So maybe the better question isn't, did the ancient Romans love blondes? Maybe it's, why do we still? And as the lights dim, and the golden glow fades into the quiet, let's leave that question hanging, like a single hair, catching the last glint of the setting sun. Softly now. Let the centuries drift away. Let the faces blur. And remember, the myths we make say more about our dreams than about the people we dream them through. Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting farther north. Past the Roman roads and the marble villas. Past the vineyards and aqueducts. Until the air turns colder, the land roughens, and the people start wearing their courage, quite literally, on their skin. Welcome to the Celtic world. A place of misty hills, iron jewelry, and woad. Now, if you've ever seen a movie about ancient warriors, perhaps one involving Mel Gibson and a lot of dramatic yelling, you've seen woad. That unmistakable blue paint smeared across faces and bodies, like the sky itself had declared war. But behind the pop culture myth lies something much quieter and stranger. Because in truth, the Celts didn't paint themselves for spectacle. They did it for identity and fashion. And, in a way, for sleep, the eternal sleep of reputation. Because when your enemies remember your blue skin more than your name, you've achieved a kind of immortality. Let's start with the basics. What is woad? Woad is a plant, Isatis tinctoria. If you crush its leaves, ferment them, and suffer through a truly vile smell for several days, you get a blue dye. The same color that would later make indigo famous. But for the ancient Celts, woad wasn't about clothes or curtains. It was about skin. Roman writers, who were equal parts fascinated and horrified by northern tribes, described warriors covered from head to foot in blue pigment. Julius Caesar himself wrote of the Britons dyed with woad, which produces a blue color, and thereby have a more terrible appearance in battle. Of course, Caesar never missed a chance to make the people he conquered sound exotic, or conveniently intimidating. But archaeological traces suggest he wasn't entirely making it up. We've found remains of woad in ancient British sites. Residue in pottery. Pigment on metal tools. And figurines, little bronze men, muscles etched in spirals, bodies marked with lines that could very well represent tattoos. Not paint that washed off, tattoos. Permanent, deliberate, ceremonial. Imagine it, you wake before dawn, the air crisp and smelling faintly of peat. You grind woad leaves into a paste, mix it with animal fat, maybe even ash. You or a companion mark your skin in swirls and lines, symbols of tribe, rank, maybe the gods. The blue stains your skin and burns slightly, the smell sharp and earthy. When the sun rises, it catches the faint shimmer of blue on your shoulders. You look like the land itself, sky and earth combined. That, to a Celt, was beauty. Celtic fashion wasn't delicate. It wasn't perfumed or powdered. It was loud, intricate, alive. Their clothing shimmered with patterns, checks, stripes, spirals, woven in bright reds, greens, and yellows. They wore heavy metal torques around their necks, thick rings of bronze, silver, or gold. They loved jewelry almost as much as they loved battle. And both, to them, were performances. Roman writers often mocked this as barbaric vanity. But the Celts had their own kind of sophistication, they just didn't measure it in marble. They measured it in bravery, and in how you wore it. Clothing wasn't just protection from the cold, it was communication. A message of status, spirit, and defiance. Their hair was part of that expression too. Both men and women styled it with lime water, which stiffened it and gave it a pale, almost fiery texture. Picture it, hair that glowed in the sun, sticking upright or swept back, smelling faintly of metal and grass. To the Romans, this looked like chaos. To the Celts, it looked like pride. Even the blue pigment had layers of meaning. Some tribes saw it as sacred, the color of divinity, of the sky, of protection. Others likely used it to intimidate, to confuse, or to signal unity before battle. And over time, what started as ritual became fashion. Not in the modern runway sense, of course, but in the cultural one, a language of appearance that told you exactly who you were standing before. The Celts, you see, didn't separate art from life. Their swords were engraved with patterns. Their shields were embossed like jewelry. Their clothing rippled with color. Even their bodies, marked in blue, wrapped in woven dyes, were extensions of that same artistic impulse. Everything was decoration. Everything was identity. It's funny, in a way. While the Romans prided themselves on marble and mosaics, the Celts made themselves the artwork. They carried their culture on their skin. And yet, most of what we know about them comes from their enemies. Romans who found them terrifying. Greeks who found them incomprehensible. later Christians who found them pagan. Each one tried to scrub away the blue, to paint over it with their own language, their own values. But the blue wouldn't fade. It never really has. Even centuries later, the stories of blue-painted warriors persisted, filtered through legend, through Shakespeare, through film. The painted people of the North became icons of resistance, symbols of raw, untamed freedom. And maybe that's why the myth still glows so brightly, even after all these centuries. Because deep down, we love the image of people who refuse to fit the mold. People who make art out of themselves. People who wear their defiance and their beauty in the open. So the next time someone talks about Celtic fashion, it isn't about tartan skirts or braided hair. It's about a worldview. A philosophy of color, texture, and courage. It's about the people who looked at the cold mist of northern dawn and thought, yes, I'll wear that. And they did. They wore the sky. They tattooed the wind. And for a moment, they were the most vivid people on earth. Let's drift next into something softer, still northern, still ancient, but with a touch of gold instead of blue. Because where the Celts painted themselves, the Vikings gilded themselves. Hey everyone, still awake? Good. Let's drift onward, north again, into colder seas and brighter fires. Tonight, we've left behind the blue-painted Celts, and we're standing on a rocky Scandinavian shore. The wind smells of salt and pine resin. Longboats creak softly in the shallows. And somewhere nearby, a man with a beard that could probably frighten small livestock is carefully combing it. Yes, combing it. Because despite their fearsome reputation, the Vikings were, well, a little bit vain. In fact, quite vain. Not that anyone could blame them. If you spend months raiding along the coast of England, you'd also want to look presentable while burning monasteries. Roman chroniclers never met them, but later monks certainly did. And while those monks didn't have much positive to say about their manners, or their habit of taking everything not nailed down, they had to admit something odd. The Vikings were annoyingly clean. Compared to the unwashed medieval Europeans who came after them, the Norse were practically spa enthusiasts. They bathed at least once a week. They had personal grooming kits. And they owned more combs than most monasteries had books. Archaeologists have found thousands of these combs, carved from bone, horn, and sometimes even walrus ivory. They were so common, you might call them the Viking equivalent of the smartphone. Always on hand. Used constantly. Probably shared far more than was sanitary. Alongside the combs came tweezers, ear spoons, and razors, all delicately made, often with intricate knotwork designs. In short, Viking men were extremely serious about their personal appearance. Their enemies thought it strange. Their lovers probably didn't mind. There's a lovely detail in an English chronicle from the 11th century that complains, quite bitterly, that English women were falling for Viking men. Apparently, these Norse invaders were just too well-groomed. Too charming. Too shiny. The chronicler writes that they made themselves exceedingly handsome by combing their hair daily, bathing every Saturday, and changing clothes often. He said this like it was a terrible moral failing. It wasn't. It was just hygiene. But to the medieval mind, cleanliness was often associated with sin, or at least with arrogance. And the Vikings had plenty of both. Let's picture one for a moment, maybe a chieftain, seated in his hall. His hair is braided, oiled, and shining in the firelight. His beard, carefully trimmed. He's wearing a wool tunic dyed in earthy reds or deep blues, colors that took effort and wealth to achieve. Around his neck, a bronze or silver chain. His cloak is fastened with a brooch shaped like two intertwining serpents. And on his arm, a massive bracelet, heavy enough to make his hand go numb, but that's the price of fashion. It's not what we picture when we think of Vikings, is it? We think of furs and mud, not embroidery and perfume. But perfume they had, or at least scented oils. In trade with the East, they brought back glass beads, spices, silk, and yes, sometimes, fragrance. If you're going to invade Paris, you might as well smell nice while doing it. Even their weapons were decorative. Swords inlaid with silver or copper. Hilts carved with runes and dragons. Because to the Vikings, beauty wasn't frivolous, it was strength made visible. A well-decorated warrior was a respected warrior. To die wearing gleaming armor wasn't vanity. It was valor. It's strange, isn't it? How we imagine the past as dirtier than it was. How we picture barbarism when there was actually style. Every age has its idea of beauty, and for the Norse, that beauty was balance, fierce but orderly, rugged but composed. Even in chaos, there was elegance. Their women, too, were fashion-conscious. They wore linen dresses under woolen aprons, held together with ornate brooches shaped like shells or animals. Those brooches weren't just decoration, they were status symbols, heirlooms, sometimes even currency. Their hair was braided in complex patterns. Their jewelry, engraved with spirals, birds, and mythical beasts. And in Viking society, both men and women wore eye makeup, a fact that always surprises modern readers. But yes, they darkened their eyes with coal or soot, a practice learned through trade routes stretching all the way to Byzantium. Not to look frightening, but to look striking. The sagas tell of women described as fair and proud, of men beautiful and bold. Beauty was not seen as vanity, it was divine. The gods themselves were radiant, golden-haired, well-dressed. To honor them, mortals had to reflect that glory. It's a small reminder that cultures we call savage often had a far more refined sense of aesthetics than the civilizations that judged them. While monks were scratching away in cold scriptoria, wearing rough woolen penance belts, Vikings were braiding each other's hair and polishing their swords until they gleamed like mirrors. But of course, everything beautiful eventually becomes myth. The Viking became a caricature, horned helmets, blood-stained faces, roaring voices. The image of barbarism overtook the truth of elegance. And yet, when we find a comb buried in the earth, carved with care, we're reminded that they weren't monsters. They were people, proud of their strength, but equally proud of how they looked when they wielded it. So if you ever find yourself in a Scandinavian museum, staring at a tiny ivory comb or a polished brooch, remember, that was someone's mirror. Someone's morning ritual. A fragment of daily vanity that outlasted their entire civilization. Let's drift onward, softly now, to another kind of royal fashion, one less rugged, more perfumed. Where instead of shipyards and braids, we have velvet, lace, and wigs the size of small farm animals. Because up next, we're heading to Versailles, where fashion became not survival, but performance. Hey everyone. Still with me? Good. Let's drift softly now to a different kind of battlefield, one fought not with swords or axes, but with combs, ribbons, and perfume. We're leaving behind the wild fjords and cold seas, and gliding toward France, to a palace so grand, so absurdly ornate, that it seems to exist purely to prove a point. The Palace of Versailles. It's evening there. Candles flicker in thousands of gilded sconces. Perfume hangs heavy in the air, layers of amber, rose, and something faintly unpleasant underneath, because hygiene wasn't always what the fragrance implied. And in the Hall of Mirrors, the courtiers glitter. Silk rustles. Jewels flash. And above all else, the wigs rise. Towering, powdered, impossible constructions. Some curling like clouds. Some wide enough to shade a small village. Some adorned with feathers, flowers, or even, at one glorious point in history, miniature ships. Because in the 17th and 18th centuries, France didn't just wear fashion. It worshipped it. Let's start with Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. He was, as his title suggests, a man not overly burdened by modesty. Louis understood one thing perfectly: power must look like power. And for him, that meant hair. You see, Louis XIV started losing his around age 23. A tragedy, by royal standards. He had been the golden youth of Europe, athletic, radiant, every inch the embodiment of divine kingship. And then, one morning, the mirror betrayed him. Naturally, he refused to surrender. Instead, he invented an entire industry to conceal his baldness. He hired the best wig makers in Paris, perruquiers, and soon, the royal court was filled with cascading waves of horsehair, yak hair, and human hair imported from wherever the empire could reach. Each piece powdered and perfumed until it gleamed like spun moonlight. A king's insecurity had become the century's aesthetic. And of course, once the king set the fashion, everyone else followed. To appear without a wig at Versailles was practically treasonous. Your wig didn't just show your style, it declared your place in the social cosmos. The bigger it was, the higher you stood. By the late 1600s, courtiers were spending entire fortunes maintaining their hairpieces. Some wigs required daily repowdering with a mixture of flour and starch, a process that left white dust coating every surface in sight. The palace must have looked like a very glamorous bakery explosion. There were even wig taxes, since their maintenance cost rivaled that of small estates. And naturally, every gentleman needed multiple wigs. One for court, one for hunting, one for dinner, and one, somehow, for mourning. Because nothing says grief like powdered horsehair. The irony, of course, is that beneath all that powdered perfection, everyone stank. Versailles was magnificent, but it was not particularly clean. Bathing was rare, water, people believed, carried disease. Instead, they relied on perfume and powder to disguise the evidence. So when we imagine these elegant nobles bowing and fluttering fans, it's worth remembering, they were doing so in a fog of sweat, starch, and musk. It must have smelled like a florist's shop on fire. Women took it even further. By the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, hairstyles had reached cosmic proportions. Wigs rose 2, sometimes 3 feet above the head, supported by wire frames and padded with wool, ribbons, even linen stuffed with horsehair. They were then powdered, curled, and sculpted into miniature scenes, complete with ships, birds, and landscapes. One famous design, the coiffure à la Belle Poule, featured a full sailing ship, masts, rigging, and all, perched atop the head. It commemorated a French naval victory. Imagine trying to nod politely at court while balancing the Battle of Toulon on your skull. Servants had to sleep beside these creations, guarding them from collapse. And because they couldn't be rebuilt daily, ladies often slept sitting up, their hair wrapped in cloth and kept in place by small cages. Romantic, in a kind of Gothic way. Of course, all this grandeur had a purpose. Versailles wasn't just about beauty. It was control. Louis XIV understood that if you make the nobility obsessed with appearance, they won't have time to rebel. So he turned politics into theater. He made fashion a leash. Every bow, every wig, every powdered cheek was part of a performance that revolved entirely around him. And it worked magnificently. Nobles bankrupted themselves trying to keep up with royal style. They spent their lives in rooms lined with gold leaf, whispering over who wore what shade of ribbon. And outside the palace gates, France began to starve. By the late 18th century, the symbolism had become unbearable. When revolution came, wigs were among the first casualties. They were relics of vanity, of the system itself. The guillotine made short work of fashion hierarchy. But even after Versailles fell, the image endured. A world of powdered faces, towering wigs, and silken dreams, fragile, absurd, and magnificent. It's a strange thought, really. That one man's insecurity, a thinning hairline, could reshape the entire visual language of European aristocracy. And perhaps even help topple it. Because that's what power often is. A performance so elaborate that it forgets the script. Let's drift onward, gently now. The powder has settled, the candles burn low, and beyond Versailles the world is changing. Empires rise, wigs shrink, and fashion shifts from nobility to the people themselves. Our next stop takes us eastward, where beauty and pain intertwined in a practice both delicate and devastating. It's time to talk about the quiet agony of Chinese foot binding, the pursuit of grace at an unimaginable cost. Hey everyone! Let's dim the lights a little more. Take a breath, slow and soft. Because where we're drifting now is not a loud place. It's quiet. Almost unbearably so. Far from the marble halls of Europe, in the courtyards of imperial China, beauty moved differently. It wasn't shouted, or powdered, or worn high on the head. It was folded inward, shaped through silence, through endurance, through ritualized pain. We're talking about foot binding. A custom both mesmerizing and horrifying. Elegant and cruel. It began over 1,000 years ago, in the palaces of the Song dynasty, and for centuries, it defined what it meant to be beautiful, noble, and desirable. But as with so many things in history, it started with a rumor. There was once a dancer at the imperial court, a concubine named Yan Yan. She was said to have bound her feet in silk to perform for the emperor, dancing on a lotus-shaped stage. Her feet were tiny, curved, delicate, as if made of new moon crescents, they said. The emperor was entranced. And from that single moment of performance, imitation began. Because in imperial China, beauty was never just about attraction. It was about power, status, and control. And foot binding, the creation of the so-called lotus foot, became one of the most powerful symbols of all three. Here's what it meant in practice. At around 5 or 6 years old, a girl's feet were first soaked in a mixture of herbs and animal blood, softening the skin. Then, one by one, the toes, except the big toe, were folded under the sole. The arch was broken deliberately, and the entire foot was bound tightly in long silk ribbons. Over time, the bones reshaped themselves. The foot shrank to 3, sometimes just 2.5 inches long. It was called a 3-inch golden lotus. And yes, it was exactly as painful as you imagine. The process lasted years. The bindings were unwrapped and retightened every few days to reshape the foot further. Girls were forced to walk on them, to train the bones into submission. Infection was common. Sometimes toes fell off from lack of circulation. But the pain was normalized. Expected. Even praised. Because a woman who endured it was considered disciplined, refined, and properly feminine. Her tiny steps, her delicate gait, were seen as graceful. Her inability to walk far without help was seen as virtuous. The logic, if we can call it that, was chilling in its elegance. By limiting a woman's movement, you displayed her gentility. She didn't work. She didn't roam. She stayed where beauty and wealth confined her. And so, generation after generation, the practice spread from the palaces of emperors to the homes of merchants, and eventually, even to rural villages. It became part of a girl's identity, a family's investment in her marriage prospects. Mothers bound their daughters' feet with the same love and resignation that their own mothers had used. It wasn't cruelty, not in their eyes. It was tradition. Duty. The quiet rhythm of centuries. The shoes, if you can call them that, were tiny embroidered slippers, bright with silk thread and pearls. They were works of art in miniature. No one would ever see the bound foot itself, that was too private, too intimate. The beauty was in the suggestion, in the idea that something so painful could appear so serene. There's a tragic poetry in it. Because the same civilization that built the Great Wall, that painted endless mountains and calligraphy scrolls, also found beauty in deformity. In restraint. In stillness. But of course, beauty is never static. As China opened to the West in the 19th century, the bound foot became a point of shame, of conflict, of sorrow. Missionaries called it barbaric. Reformers called it backward. Feminists, yes, there were feminists, called it slavery. And slowly, over the early 20th century, it began to unravel. The last generation of bound-foot women were still alive as recently as the early 2000s, their feet, small and twisted, bearing the memory of 1,000 years of obedience. They had lived through dynasties, revolutions, and empires. And yet, when interviewed, many of them still called their feet beautiful. Because that's what beauty had meant to them all their lives. To unlearn it was impossible. It's tempting to see the story of foot binding as pure cruelty, and in a way, it is. But it's also a reminder of how culture can take hold of pain and turn it into meaning. How societies can mistake suffering for elegance. And how often, across time, women have been the canvas upon which civilizations painted their ideals. The lotus foot is long gone now, but the idea lingers, the notion that to be beautiful, one must endure, restrict, diminish. It's not unique to China. It's global. It's timeless. So maybe, in this soft moment before sleep, we can hold a small empathy for them, for the girls who were told that pain was grace, and who learned to walk beautifully on broken bones. Let's drift onward, now, away from the silk and silence of the East, back toward the cold marble of the West, where another kind of body modification took root. Less graceful, perhaps, but just as telling. Because next, we're stepping into the world of Victorian corsetry, where steel, silk, and social pressure squeeze the human body into an hourglass of class and control. Good night, everyone. And may your dreams be just bright enough. Sparkles.